Vimansa.
Hello and welcome to Vimansa Initiative. Vimansa Initiative is an independent think tank in Sri Lanka which provides a platform for critical analysis, intellectual dialogue, and policy advocacy on economic, political, and social issues. We are pleased to present you another episode of its interview series under the theme Rising China. Through this interview series, Vimansa brings about the views of intellectuals and experts on various dimensions of the miraculous development experience of China by drawing parallels for Sri Lanka. This interview is with Dr. Pradeep Perera, an energy and environmental economist of the Asian Development Bank, to talk about circular economy and ecological civilization in China. He is Dr. Sirimala Beratne, professor in economics from the University of Colombo, to conduct the discussion with Dr. Pradeep Perera.
So in that context, Pradeep, what are these new concepts that you are talking about? Circular economy, ecological civilization, and so on.
Thank you very much. I think basically the development is basic. I mean, when you call development is the enhancing the quality of life of the people in a sustainable manner. That is what I would mean by development. That means that you would be your living conditions, your quality of life of your population of a particular country improves compared to the previous generations. That's the story of human development. When we enhance our economic development and when we enhance our material well-being, what happened is that in certain instances that happens at the expense of the natural environment. So people tend to exploit the environment. People tend to extract various resources from the environment, and the material well-being of the people is ensured at the expense of the environment, and you end up with a degraded environment. And because the material well-being of humankind is dependent on various attributes that we extract from the environment. If you degrade your environment to maintain your current lifestyle in a particular generation, the sustainability of this development in the longer run would be questionable, and the current sort of level of consumption of the environmental resources may not be sustainable in the long term, and the price has to be paid by the future generations. So in the new sort of development thinking, what is promoted is what is called the sustainable development. I mean, there are various related terms, I think, to that term. Sustainable development means that your development doesn't happen at the expense of your future generations, and the future generations also will have the same sort of environmental natural resources that they can depend on. I think the other two terms that you mentioned, the ecological civilization, is something that the Chinese government has came up with during their 13th five-year plan from 2010 to 2015 time frame to ensure that ensure that the development happens in a sustainable manner, and the civilizational aspect of the Chinese civilization would not be jeopardized due to the rapid development, so that ecology would be maintained in its original form, while the civilization or the development material development of the Chinese population continues. So that's the sort of link between this sustainable development and ecological civilization. And then the circular economy is also basically something which is related to this concept, where the resources that you extract from the environment, and once you transform that into a certain useful product, there are a certain amount of material that could be sort of left out as side products or the byproducts of that conversion process. And also whatever the material that you, whatever the thing, the products that you produce after their useful lifetime, they still contain certain amount of natural resources. So these would be reused in a circular manner. So both the byproducts as well as your final products after its utilization will be reused in the economic cycle several times, and so you don't kind of run out of the natural resources. You, instead of extracting natural resources, you use the resources that you have used once and reform them again to be reused in a new form. So that circular aspect of that is, I think, being mentioned as the circular economy.
Very good. Now, you clearly mentioned something very important that we need to take seriously. That earlier we used to think that development only in terms of your material wealth, and you increase your per capita income, and then you increase your wealth and then become developed, become richer, and then you are called developed. But at the same time, now you are talking about something different. You take the concept of development in a broader sense. That means it is not only the material well-being, but even to maintain, sustain that in the long run. You need to strike a balance between what you achieve as well as the environmental aspects that you are maintaining. So in that context, and you mentioned that if you don't consider this balance, and future generations will have to pay for that. So today, there is a big talk about this climate change all over the world, and there are international conferences, protocols happening, and world leaders gather to design programs and all these things regarding climate change. So is this something that our former generations have created so that our generation and future generation, we have to pay for that? Climate change. What is your view about that?
Yes, I think this is also somewhat related to this concept of sustainable development. The industrial revolution happened around 200 years ago in Western Europe. Then it was extended to the US. And the industrial revolution was primarily based on the use of fossil fuel, primarily coal for energy generation. And then with the invention of the internal combustion engine at the turn of the century, 18th century to 19th century, the oil has also become a very useful and critical sort of input to the economic development that happens over the last 200 years. Recently, around 50 years ago, natural gas also became another source of energy. So all these sources of energy, once they are consumed, the byproduct is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide has this potential of creating kind of a greenhouse effect, and that would result in a gradual increase in the global temperature, global average temperature. There are several other reasons for this climate change, in addition to the increase in the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. There are several other industrial gases that can also cause the same kind of global warming. This includes the methane, which is released to the atmosphere when natural gas is leaked during its usage, as well as certain agricultural practices, land use changes also result in increasing methane. And there are several other industrial gases which also cause the same kind of phenomenon. So people started, the scientists have started getting concerned about this starting from 1990s, when it was noticed that the concentration of CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere started increasing from 300 parts per million. That is what we studied when I was studying my science. As a high school student, we used to study that carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is 300 parts per million. Today, it has reached something around 420 parts per million. And this has resulted in an increase in the global warming. And today, the latest figure is that it's around 1.2 degree warmer compared to the pre-industrial times, the average temperature. Now, this results in many changes to the ecology, changes to the climate. So one of the obvious things is the melting of the glaciers in the Antarctic and Arctic. And that melting results in an increase in the sea level. Once the sea level start increasing, basically the coastal areas will start getting flooding, and also the rivers will become saline, and all these issues will create problems. Now already low-lying countries like Bangladesh and some small island nations like Maldives, they are coming under this pressure. I mean, I was in Bangladesh recently, and there were people who were protesting because their drinking water has become saline due to the salinity intrusion into their freshwater systems. And also the global warming result in increase in storms, typhoons, cyclones, those kind of activities, and the desertification, and also the lowering of the productivity, soil productivity. All these issues will happen. And now I think we are starting to talk about climate refugees. People from the affected areas, they will start moving into the other regions, and that result in various political and economic issues. So if this trend continues, it is expected that the global warming would be more than 3 degrees by the end of the century. And that would be a disaster. And so climate change has become the most critical existential issue facing the humankind today. And climate change is also a classic economic problem of what we call market failure, because and it's a global scale market failure, because the action that is required to be taken to mitigate climate change has to be taken by certain economic actors in certain countries, but the benefit is global. So if you decide to invest in climate-friendly technologies, you have to pay for that. But the benefit of that investment, or the benefit of that change in behavior would accrue to everybody in the planet. So it's very difficult to align the economic incentives and the economic cost to achieve this balance. That is what is preventing a kind of a consolidated action by various actors to address this climate change. Everybody thinks that somebody else will do the needful, and it is not my problem; it's somebody else's problem. And then I think there's also a lot of blame game happening. The main sort of, I mean, if the other important thing about climate change is this carbon dioxide, once emitted, it stays in the atmosphere. So whether even the carbon dioxide that was emitted 200 years ago is still causing the problem. So the argument of the developing countries is that most of the carbon dioxide emissions were caused by today's industrialized countries. And as a result, they are the ones who should pay for that. So countries like China, India, Brazil, I mean, these kind of countries are saying that it is not our responsibility. It is the responsibility of the developed countries who cause this problem, and they are the ones who should pay for that. On the other hand, the developed countries are saying it's true that we caused the carbon dioxide emissions. We emitted most of the carbon dioxide emissions in the past. But if you take today's emissions, today the most highest amount of carbon dioxide are emitted by the developing countries, especially China and India. And as a result, they are saying that these countries also should take action to mitigate the climate change. So there's this debate going on at the global forums between who should pay for that and who should take the action. Now they came up with this term called common but differentiated responsibilities as a way out to come out of this issue. And I am pleased to hear that during this Glasgow summit recently, and prior to that even in the Paris summit, there has been some consensus that everybody should take action. It's not one or the other. It has to be by everybody. But but still I think there's no consensus on where should the investment and where should the money come from. So I think this issue, I think, continues to be dominated. I mean, the world development discussions is likely to be continued to be dominated by this issue, because this has the potential of unraveling most of the development gains that humankind has achieved over the last 50, 60 years. I mean, if this continues in the current form, and if we could not limit the global temperature to less than 2 degrees, the planet will would become extremely difficult to maintain the current level of population and current level of living conditions. So, I think it's a existential issue, and it needs concerted actions by everybody.
Whoever that has to be responsible for the climate change and environmental degradation for which that we are paying today. In fact, it has been the mistake that we did in the name of development, to my understanding. Now, if it is the case, I have an important question, Pradeep. This is the discussion series under the theme Rising China. And we know that China, the environmental degradation of China and environmental pollution in mainly the urban cities in China, including Beijing. And that has been quoted as a case, big environmental problem in the world some time back. But China quickly took initiatives to arrest this particular problem. Now, how did China transform its economy? Through some innovative concepts such as the circular economy and ecological civilization, the two important terms that you mentioned earlier. Over to you.
Basically, China has China's economy transformed in a very rapid and a very significant manner, starting from 1979, when the Chinese have decided to adopt the open kind of private sector-led kind of economic growth. Now, starting from around 2000, once the China has entered the World Trade Organization, there has been a very rapid development of China. At that time, the Chinese government was mostly focusing on the economic development. But in 2006 to 2010 5-year plan, at that time the government realized that the energy consumption is going at a very rapid rate, and this is not sustainable. So they put certain measures to reduce that. Primarily, they set a target on energy intensity. The energy intensity is basically defined as the amount of energy used per unit of GDP. And they said that the energy intensity should be reduced by 20% over that 5-year period. So this target was not only a target. I mean, they also initiated a series of measures to achieve this target. One was that all the large energy consuming enterprises, industries mainly, as well as power sector, oil and gas sector, all these energy heavy sort of industries, they were asked to come up with roadmaps to reduce their energy intensity and to transform their industrial processes to be more efficient. And then the management of these enterprises were held accountable to achieving these targets. Now, this was continued in the next 5-year plan from 2011 to 2015. During that time, they also introduced the concept of, in addition to the energy intensity, they also set targets for carbon intensity. That is the amount of carbon dioxide emitted per unit of GDP. And again, these were coordinated from the highest levels of the government, from the National Development and Reform Commission, which is the planning commission, the central level planning body of the Chinese government. And they set up a separate department called Resource Efficiency Department to ensure the achievement of these targets. And these targets were set not only at the central level; they were allocated to the provinces, then to the municipalities, and to the counties, and also to various industries. And the larger industries, starting with the industries that were consuming more than 100,000 tons of coal equivalent. Then it has been reduced to 10,000 in this next phase. So they increased the number of enterprises coming under this scheme. So all these enterprises were asked to come up with this kind of improvement measures, efficiency improvement measures. At the same time, the Chinese government also initiated a kind of a structural transformation of the economy. Instead of, China's, if you take China's GDP, it's quite different to most of the countries. It has a very heavy concentration of industries, and usually the contribution of industrial sector to GDP in most countries is around 25-30%. In China, it used to be more than 50%. And they realized that such a heavy concentration on the industry is having a heavy toll on the environment. So they took measures to reduce the share of industries in the GDP and to increase the share of services in the economy. That is also to reduce the export dependency of Chinese economy, because Chinese economy was primarily driven by exports until 2015. By that time, I think China started having a more domestic focus economic strategy. Because there's a limit that they can achieve through the export-led kind of development trajectory, and they wanted to increase the domestic consumption, which is mainly in the services sector. So as a result, there was a structural shifting that was happening in the Chinese economy, and this because the service sector consumes a lesser amount of energy per unit output compared to the industrial sector. This also resulted in a reduction in the energy intensity and carbon intensity. Another thing that happened was around 2012, 2013, the Chinese, most of the Chinese cities, especially Beijing and the surrounding cities in the northern China, came under heavy air pollution mainly due to the heavy use of coal, both for industries as well as a heating source, because in China during the winter you need heating. So they were using burning coal, I think, as a heating fuel. So all this resulted in a very heavy sort of smog, and this had health impacts. So the Chinese government basically declared war on pollution, and they initiated very drastic measures. They shut down large number of coal-fired industries, coal-fired power plants, and they set targets, and they held the local government officials personally responsible for achieving this target. And this was included in the evaluation criteria of the performance evaluation criteria of the local officials, and it was monitored by a deputy prime minister level person in the government. So they managed to reduce the air pollution significantly during this period. So I think we should also make a distinction between what is the air pollution and the climate change. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is a gas that would result in global warming, but it's not a pollutant. It's not bad for the human health. So the pollution control measures taken by China help both the carbon dioxide reduction as well as the pollution controls. It's like a co-benefit. So I think the one thing that the China had done, I think, was as a major economy. And China has also become the largest emitter of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in 2010. Until then, that dubious honor was with the US. Now China has claimed the #1 position when it comes to the carbon dioxide emissions due to its huge industrial base. Today, China emits around 28% of the global CO2 emissions, a fourth of them. And US is emitting around 14%, so about half of what the China is emitting. And India is about 7%. So these are the three main countries. And between these three countries, they emit around 50% of the global CO2 emissions. I think so. China has recognized its responsibility as a leading economy, that it should play a major role in reducing the CO2 emissions. And they, as I mentioned earlier, they took all these measures to reduce the energy and carbon intensity. And also, it started shifting its economy towards a more decarbonized and a low carbon trajectory. And what they did was they promoted the renewable energy as a main source of energy. But I mean, still the coal contributes more than 60% of the energy consumption in China. China has a lot of domestic coal resources. So it's coal is a integral part of the Chinese economy. It is not like in Sri Lanka, where we don't have a coal industry. In China, the coal is not only a fuel, it's also a way of life for most of the people. I mean, coal mining is heavily, I mean, certain states, certain provinces in China, the bulk of the economy revolves around the coal industry. So basically, delinking coal is a major challenge because even in some of the industries which usually don't use coal as a raw material, but in Chinese context, they use coal as the raw material. For instance, even the plastic manufacturing in China, coal is the main sort of raw material. So they are now coming up with various technologies which are to reduce the coal consumption and to promote the renewable energy. And at the same time, China has positioned itself as the leading manufacturer of renewable energy devices, both solar panels, and nowadays, I think even electric vehicles, the batteries that are used for energy storage. All these technologies, China has achieved the #1 position by strategically positioning themselves in the industrial value chain. So basically, China has managed to position itself to achieve the prime position or the leading position in the emerging sort of technologies related to the energy transition. So I think I'll stop on that, and I hope I gave
Yes,
some answers.
Pradeep, now with your expertise, knowledge, and wide experience in this particular field, as well as your knowledge about the Chinese economy and the innovative concepts like circular economy and ecological civilization in China. When you look at through these things, the Sri Lankan case, what do you think? We also recognize that Sri Lanka has to emphasize more on its industrialization and export promotion, and in that context, and are we doing enough to look after our environment, or what are the experience? What can we learn from the Chinese experience? What is your view about this?
I think in Sri Lankan context, we haven't had the industrialization. I mean, Sri Lanka, due to, in spite of all the efforts that had been taken, I mean, we are still at a very primitive level of industrial value chain. We have not sort of I mean, we are not broken out of the initial sort of level of industrialization, like apparel industry. We are still stuck in very low value added kind of industries. These are also not very energy intensive. So I think our environment has not been severely damaged due to industrialization. And we also don't have mining as a main source of our economy. So mining is generally quite destructive industry when it comes to the environment. So fortunately, we don't have that. And that also resulted in that low, I mean, that also contributed to our low industrialization, because mining provide the raw material that is required for most of the industries. So we are basically a service-oriented economy in Sri Lanka, and our environment has pretty much managed to keep it in a quite a pristine form. But I think now I think for Sri Lanka to maintain its living conditions, we need to find a competitive niche. I think how the country, as a country, how Sri Lanka can progress. So given our geographical location and given our low natural resource base, I think the Sri Lankan government has correctly decided that Sri Lanka should be more of a service economy rather than a manufacturing economy. And our energy consumption, I think our per capita energy consumption and our per capita carbon emission is quite low. I mean, even compared to a country like India, which has a lower per capita income than Sri Lanka, but they do consume more energy and they do emit more carbon dioxide on per capita basis compared to us. So I think so basically I think we should maintain this cleaner kind of economic structure that we do have at the moment. And at the same time, I don't believe that Sri Lanka has to fight the war against the climate change. I mean, Sri Lanka is not a major contributor to this climate change. I mean, our per capita basis, our per capita emissions are very low, and even in absolute terms, the total amount of emissions from Sri Lanka is negligible in the global kind of setting. So unlike major economies like India, China, India, US, Europe, Brazil, South Africa, Australia, those kind of countries, we cannot make much of a difference when it comes to climate change. But we have to be ready that we can be a victim of the climate change because the global sea level rising, increased amount of this storms and cyclones can affect our economy, and so we need to be resilient. I mean, we have to build our infrastructure in a climate resilient manner. But I think at the same time, I think the fossil fuel based energy consumption is not going to be sustainable in the long term. Sri Lanka has one coal power plant in North Chile, and then we are now talking about some LNG based power plants. LNG is relatively cheaper than coal, but it is still a fossil fuel and still resulting CO2 emissions. And in the emerging sort of global economy, it would be very difficult to get financing for this fossil fuel-based power plants. I mean, the official financiers of such financing like Asian Development Bank, World Bank, those kind of finances will not finance these projects. Even bilateral lenders, including China. China has made a pledge in Glasgow meeting that they will not finance any coal power plants outside their country. So it will become very difficult to finance these projects going forward. So Sri Lanka has to come up with a very coherent and credible strategy to meet its energy needs using renewable energy. Sri Lanka has more or less fully exploited its hydro resources. So then I think what we have left now is the solar and wind energy. And we need to be very strategic how we are going to develop these industries. I think we have to have a very transparent procurement policies on how we get the investments into these sectors. It has to be open, transparent kind of a system. I think this so-called unsolicited proposals, people come in and making various offers at various negotiated prices is not the way to go forward. We have to identify what are the areas where this kind of development can take place. And then the land acquisition is a very critical thing because this renewable energy development requires a lot of land. So government has to allocate and earmark whatever the land that is required. And then the investor should be provided with a very clean kind of investment scenario where he need to only focus on the building of the power plant. He should not be worried about various environmental approvals and various approvals or the land acquisition. His job is to come and put the plant and connect it to the grid. The rest of it should be taken care of the government. And that's the model that has been adapted in China, India, various other countries, where they develop various huge, what they call renewable energy parks. And these parks were then offered to the private sector on a competitive basis to come and invest in renewable energy plants. So that way, I think they managed to bring down the cost of renewable energy because it's a very transparent process. So I think we need to learn from that. I mean, unfortunately, the recent sort of development in Sri Lanka is going in the opposite direction, where various vested interests are promoting these unsolicited proposals. But that is not the way to go forward. I think we should be very strategic. And also Sri Lanka, I think going forward, I think should think of some of the newer technologies that are coming up, like offshore wind, especially in the Gulf of Mannar. There are a lot of good resources for offshore wind development that also should be looked in. thing is that when you have a lot of renewable, you also need to think about the energy security, because renewable energy by definition is intermittent, and it doesn't provide the same amount of reliability as conventional power plants. So you need to have some kind of backup schemes or storage systems where energy is to be stored. So that also need to be looked into, and we have to invest in the storage devices, as well as I think we can think of having a power transmission link with India, so that whenever there is a supply shortage here, we would have the option of purchasing power from India and fixing that that gap. I think these are some of the areas that we can think of. But another area is that we also should think of developing the manufacturing capacity of these renewable technologies. I mean, that is something that we have not been paying much attention. We are only thinking of renewable energy as a source of energy. But I think if you take the Chinese example, when China started investing in solar plant manufacturing, China did not have much of a demand for solar power. So basically, they were in the export market. And at that time, around 2010, there was a very attractive subsidy mechanism for solar power in Germany and in some of the European countries. So Chinese government incentivized the Chinese industry to invest in solar panels and shift and basically to target the German market. And when Germany has realized that the solar plants are coming from China and try to protect their sort of domestic German market, the China had the surplus capacity. At that point, the Chinese government incentivized the investment in China, so that that surplus industrial capacity can be utilized in the domestic market. Likewise, I think they have been very fleet-footed. I think whenever they see an opportunity, they go and invest. And then when the changes, they have the flexibility as well as the scale to manage the demand and supply. Now, I think even in these emerging technologies like energy storage, China has already achieved the #1 status. Electric vehicles is another area. I think more than 5-7 years ago, I think China has realized that the electric vehicle is going to be a game changer, and that's an area where they could exploit. And now I think several Chinese brands are competing with the global leaders in electric vehicles. And although China doesn't have very good brands when it comes to the traditional vehicles, but in electric vehicle field, they have what is called the first move advantage. So I think Sri Lanka also need to think ahead. I mean, we can't be thinking back. I think and what we have done past and what has worked for us in the past, I think we have to think ahead, and we need to identify what are the evolving technologies, evolving opportunities, and then position our economy to exploit those opportunities. I think that's the lesson that we can learn from China. Chinese have always been looking around and seeing what are the opportunities that are coming up, and then they position themselves to exploit those opportunities.
So your final message is actually, although Sri Lanka has not been a big contributor to the global environmental degradation and climate change, but Sri Lanka has to be cautious about its development process. And particularly with respect to our regulatory mechanism, there are weak areas that we need to improve. So thank you very much, Pradeep, for joining today to tell us and to share your in-depth knowledge in this particular area, which is very, very important for the Sri Lankan economy as well. Thank you very much.